15 minutes left. Elon Musk ordered you to open this now. This is very serious about your life. The fluorescent clock above the doorway flickered once and then steadied, its digits yawning open like a mouth that had been asleep too long and was now learning to speak again. You could feel the numbers in your rib cage, a mechanical echo that matched the irregularness of your pulse. Everyone says time is an illusion until it becomes a sharp physical thing, a blade that cuts decisions down to size. You had always thought that was a metaphor until tonight, until the last coffee had gone cold, and the skyline outside the window had been reduced to a smear of sodium orange and distant headlights. Now time was a physical pressure, something pressing from all directions until your shoulders stooped under it. You had been given a list, or rather a sequence. Breathe, remember, choose, run if necessary. The list was absurd in its simplicity, like instructions for surviving a storm written by someone who had never seen the water rise. Breath in. Breath out. Remember, choose. The memory unfolded like old film, poorly developed, but there were frames you could stare at until they sharpened. The smell of lemon oil in your mother's kitchen. The way your father's hands folded newspapers with surgical care. The laugh that used to ripple through the apartment building when someone attempted to play jazz badly on a Tuesday night. Small anchors, nothing to do with clocks or threats. And yet, when you pulled on them, the seconds lengthened as if memory could slow the motion of the world for a moment. You stood and walked to the window. The city was a grid of embered veins, warm lights pulsing in office towers that would in 15 minutes be no different than they were now. But to you they were a countdown carved into glass. People moved like constellations, tiny predetermined trajectories that struck you as both fragile and stubborn. A woman in a red coat hurried with purpose that belonged in a different story. A taxi skidded, then found its groove again. You watched a child on a curb dragging a stick as if it were a staff capable of guiding storms. The stick moved the air, not fate. Fate, you thought, was more prosaic. Calls unanswered, doors unopened, the small procrastinations that infected a life until they stacked into a hazard. 15 minutes left. The absurdity of being ordered to open something now reverberated through your thoughts like a gong. The word ordered carried a peculiar intimacy of command and trust. Elon Musk, the visionary behind rockets and electric dreams, had instructed you to open this, to witness, to react. Orders can be a rope you grip for safety, or a rope that tethers you to a cliff you hadn't seen until the wind picks up. You wanted to know the origin. You did not want to know. Both yearnings coexisted and tugged like children at a blanket. You checked your phone. No new messages beyond the hypnotic timer and a single image, an old Polaroid of two people, elbows touching, laughing at something off frame. The caption scribbled in a hand that had knotted the ink at the end read, "If this is the last, make it better." You laughed then, a short sound that stung because it was both defiant and foolish. Better how? You can't make a last better. You can only make a last honest. So you set yourself to that task. Honesty in the face of compressing time is a strange exercise. Words become distilled, stripped of all their superfluous velvet. What remained were the raw threads. Love, apology, a list of things you had never bothered to say because they were quiet and assumed to last. You picked up a pen and tore a page from a notebook, the paper brittle with neglect. Your handwriting wavered at first. "If you are reading this," you started, then my hands were steady enough to write. That sound of self-mockery was necessary. Otherwise, the page might have begun to weep. You wrote about ordinary things. The kindness of a barista who always remembered your order. The small garden on the balcony that had refused to die through 3 winters. The time you had climbed a ladder to rescue a cat and discovered on the roof a view of the city like a confession. You wrote apologies that tasted like pennies, for forgetting birthdays, for the times you had chosen convenience over courage, for words left unspoken. You wrote thank yous that felt extravagant in the face of an indifferent universe. Thank you for morning coffee, for late-night philosophy, for the small human mercies that made life possible. Outside, the sound of traffic shifted, a distant hum, altering its timbre like an orchestra tuning down. Inside, the apartment felt like a stage cleared for an intimate performance. You thought of doors. They were the most democratic of objects, open, closed, locked, each a decision. You unlocked the old china cabinet and took out an envelope you'd never meant to open. A letter folded into quarters, heavy with the grammar of regret. It was your father's handwriting, spidery and patient, the loops careful like bridges. "If you ever need a map," the letter said, "remember where the light in the pantry falls in the late afternoon. If you can find that, you can find your way back to yourself." You held the paper between your fingers, feeling the faint ridges of the ink. Maps are passive things until you choose to follow their lines. You had wasted many afternoons looking at maps and none finding the courage to act on them. 15 minutes left. The timer ticked like a metronome to which your thoughts danced jittery measures. You didn't know what would happen when the countdown completed. Was it a door opening to a revelation or a bell signaling closure? You had stopped believing in grand cosmic judgments. The world, you had become certain, was more interested in quiet collapses. A bridge in a book left unread, an echo in an unused room. Yet there was an urge, a dirge-like melody, to make something of the next slices of time. The urge wasn't for survival in the cinematic way that movies promise. It was for coherence, for a narrative you could own when the ledger was balanced. You thought of the woman on the 4th floor who tended the plants and hummed tunelessly at sunrise. You thought of a boy on the corner who sold handmade bracelets and the way his hands always smelled faintly of chalk. You thought of the old man at the bus stop who fed pigeons as if they were small lawmakers deciding the city's fate. Each of these small lives were constellations of decency that had never been acknowledged properly by the official histories. And in 15 minutes such histories would feel meaningless. If truth had gravity, it was composed of small, weighty acts of attention. You made a list, not a to-do list. That would be lunatic. A to-say list. You walked each name through your mouth like a key. "I'm sorry," you said aloud to the photograph on the mantel, to a dog-shaped shadow that had been yours for a decade, to a plant that had outlived your patience. "Thank you. I loved you then. I love you now." Saying things gave them shape, made them resistant to the erasure that modern life specializes in. You wanted to be honest in the simplest way, to state plainly what had been felt, to admit where you had failed, to celebrate small victories that had never made it into birthdays or plaques. Outside, someone laughed, a short, free sound that cracked the heaviness like glass. It reminded you that the city moved on its own axis, indifferent to personal catastrophes. That was a strange comfort. If the world could move on, then whatever came next would be part of a larger stanza. You could be a line in a poem, a comma, an exclamation. You could be a footnote. The language itself didn't care. The importance we grant ourselves was the real currency. You chose to exchange it for tenderness. You dialed 3 numbers. The first was the woman in the red coat. You had been lovers years ago, each believing the other immortal in different ways. You had parted with neat phrases and tidy rations. She answered on the second ring. Her voice a puzzle of surprise and what wasn't said. You didn't ask for forgiveness. You didn't have the right. You said simply, I was wrong about things I thought were important. Her silence was a kind of listening loud as thunder. I remember the way you used to fold your socks, you added. Ridiculous in its specificity, because specificity is a tender weapon. She laughed then, and it sounded like a door opening. She said, we were young. Which is often a sufficient answer and sometimes a lie. You spoke until the line warmed with the ghosts of your earlier selves, and when you hung up, the last note on which your conversation rested was human and not heroic. The second call was to your sister. You had not spoken in months because topics mutate into weapons if left unmanaged. You had rehearsed lines in the mirror and thrown all of them away. You told her about the letter from your father, about the pantry light, about stolen afternoons, and the way memory can be a lighthouse or a prison. You apologized for small violences, for the times you had been impatient, for the chance to say, I love you, you had let slip away into the gap between breakfast and the commute. She listened in a way that made you feel seen as a person, not a problem. She said, come home if you can. And in her voice was a map, the kind that isn't precise, but somehow necessary. The third call was the least planned. A number you had found scribbled on a receipt at the bottom of a shoebox, an old friend you had lost to ambition and time. The friend picked up with a startled cheer, as if plucked from a long conversation. You spoke of absurd triumphs and failures that looked from a distance quite similar. You made jokes that only the two of you could remember, and for a moment the world outside the apartment did not exist. It was an illicit pleasure to be 20 again and foolish, but with the added cruelty of years that made foolishness tender. The clock announced 10 minutes left, then 9. The numbers marched like soldiers that knew their route. You crouched by the radio and turned the dial until a familiar song bled through, the kind that belongs to your childhood and therefore has the power to soundtrack any catastrophe with the domesticity of an old sitcom. The melody warmed you from the inside, less like a tonic and more like a truth serum. You tried to catalog what the song made you feel and failed because emotions are not neat taxonomies. They are messy overlapping strata. Grief and gratitude sat next to each other like uninterested roommates. You cooked an egg. It felt like an act of protest against high drama. Hatching heat into something edible was an assertion. Life requires small tasks. The egg popped as the shell gave way. Quiet as a private joke. You ate standing up, which felt ceremonious, and watched the last-minute stretch like soft taffy. With each bite, you felt the sum of undone gestures thin out, less culpable. It was absurd to ascribe moral arithmetic to dinner. Yet you notice the relief that arrives with caloric completion, the knowledge that the body will not betray you at the last moment with annoying emptiness. You wrote one more thing on the torn page and folded it with unnecessary care. If nothing else, you wrote, "Be kind." The sentence felt small but stubborn, like a plant growing through a crack in concrete. Kindness, you reflected, was a practical theology. It asked no metaphysical guarantees. It simply required presence. It was cheap and expensive and available almost always. 7 minutes 6. There was a new sound at the window. The stirring of clouds making room for a moon that had been shy earlier. You watched its slow insistence, the way it crossed the sky like a hand smoothing the surface of some invisible fabric. You imagined your life as fabric and saw the seams, choices with raw edges, patched decisions, stitches of luck. You made a promise to yourself to sew better, to repair old seams, not with denial, but with attention. Sewing is a humble art, but you liked the metaphor. Repair requires time the way truth requires patience. When the final minute approached, you found yourself astonished by calm. It wasn't theatrical serenity. It was a narrow, plain quiet, the kind that arrives when the mind stops manufacturing distractions and faces what is. You didn't know what would come when the clock rolled over its last face. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything. You had learned that the future is not a container waiting to be filled, but a corridor you pace into step by step. At 30 seconds, you stood in the middle of the room and felt the weight of small things: a mug with a chip on the rim, a book with dog-eared pages, a sweater that still smelled faintly like an exhale. You had once thought that meaning was a jewel to be sought. Now you recognized it as a household of small objects that assembled become alive. The clock reached 10:08. You counted with it because counting is a kind of company. 5. 4. You closed your eyes. When the clock hit 0, there was no trumpet, no apocalypse. There was only a subtle shift in the air, like when a room exhales. The fluorescent digits blinked and then returned to normal time, ticking onward with the same indifferent precision as before. You laughed then, a sound that was partly relief and partly the recognition of a trick. The drama had belonged to you, not to the machine. Elon Musk had sent the urgent message, giving you a present wrapped in panic, the sudden knowledge of finitude. Finite things tend to become sharp and precious. The world did not end. You found that strangely merciful. Instead, you had been given an hourglass whose last grains you had turned into a list of plain statements. I am sorry. I love you. Be kind. You folded the page and put it in the envelope, sealing it with a stamp of human intention. You left the window open just enough for the night to whisper in and for a breeze to rearrange the notes on your mantle into a new order. The city continued its luminous indifference, but you felt a small warmth that had nothing to do with light and everything to do with having said the things that mattered. If Elon Musk had ordered you to open something, perhaps what mattered was less the authority behind the order and more the fact that for a brief electric stretch of time you had been forced into clarity. There are moments that arrive like exams you didn't study for and leave you changed not because of what they ask of you but because of the way you answer. You had answered with ordinary courage and the slant honesty of a person who had finally understood that the small kindnesses are the durable currency of life. The night deepened. You folded the chair back into place, turned off the lamp, and let the apartment fill with that particular darkness that is not empty but waiting. In the space between one breath and the next, you felt the steadiness of decisions made plain, of words finally spoken, and like someone emerging from a long tunnel, you realized that the life you wanted was not a dramatic rescue, but the slow, relentless accumulation of acts that in aggregate become salvation. The night didn't collapse into silence so much as it stretched. An elastic thread pulled further than you thought it could go without snapping. The clock no longer mocked you with its countdown, but you couldn't unhear the tick that still reverberated inside your chest. It wasn't the machine anymore. It was you. Your own heart had taken up the rhythm, steady as a drummer in the corner of a room you could not see. You wondered if that meant you had internalized the urgency or if perhaps you had been living on a borrowed countdown all along, only now aware of it. You walked barefoot across the apartment, each step announcing itself in the creak of old wood. The floor had listened to every argument, every laugh, every night of insomnia when you had traced the constellations of cracks above the bed. Tonight it seemed almost conspiratorial, as though each groan beneath your feet was a reminder, you are still here. You are still weight. You are still real. You touched the wall in passing, palm against plaster, as if to reassure yourself of the boundary between you and the world. On the counter lay the folded envelope. You stared at it the way one studies a small flame in a drafty room. Would you leave it there or would you deliver it? The difference between words written and words received was enormous. The former was confession, the latter communion. You toyed with the thought of slipping it under a neighbor's door or mailing it without a return address, letting it become a message in a bottle washed up in someone else's life. But you knew too that some messages belong not in circulation but in safekeeping. A faint hum rose outside the window. Not traffic this time, but the low thrum of something airborne, mechanical, too slow for a jet, too steady for a helicopter. You leaned out and scanned the sky. Nothing but the moon now at its peak. A clean coin above the skyline. Yet the sound remained, a presence without a source, like a thought you couldn't trace back to origin. You closed the window halfway, leaving just enough of a gap for air, but not enough for mystery to invade. Restlessness settled into your bones. You poured water into a glass and drank slowly, letting the cold travel down your throat like a messenger. Then you sat at the table with your notebook, the pen poised again. This time, not an emergency note, a continuation. You began to write about the city itself, the way it hummed at night, alive and impersonal, how it was both cradle and predator. You wrote about the unremarkable people who had saved you in unremarkable ways. The stranger who gave directions when you were lost, the cashier who slid a coin back across the counter so you wouldn't come up short. The neighbor who watered your plants when you traveled. You realized as you wrote that your life was less your own than you believed. It was constructed from invisible scaffolding of other people's small mercies. An hour passed without you noticing. The notebook pages grew dense with cramped lines, thoughts stacked like bricks, and for once you weren't concerned about neatness. You were building something, though you didn't know if it was a record or a refuge. The words came like tidewater, drawn by the gravity of what you had nearly lost, by the phantom threat of an ending that had never arrived. It occurred to you that endings need not be real to be transformative. The possibility alone was enough to rewire a life. At some point, you stood, stretched, and turned on the small radio again. Static at first, then a late-night voice speaking in tones designed to soothe insomniacs and truck drivers. "You are listening," the voice said, "to the hour that belongs to no one." You smiled at that. Maybe this hour was yours after all. Borrowed though it might be, you imagined the unseen audience scattered across highways and kitchens, each person tethered by the same thin thread of sound. You felt less alone. Sleep tugged at you, but you resisted. Instead, you opened the cabinet where you kept a shoebox of mementos. Inside were tokens that seemed banal by daylight, but now shimmered with gravity: a movie ticket stub, a key that no longer fit any lock, a stone you picked up at a beach and forgotten to discard. You held each object as though weighing it against the scale of your own existence. Did these small relics add up to a story? Or were they crumbs on a trail you'd been unconsciously following back to yourself? The hum outside returned louder this time, and with it a draft that rattled the blinds. You went to the